Is my husband a sex addict? Well, there are several elements that are involved with any addiction, and sex addiction is no different. One of those elements is unmanageability. So a person tries to stop that behavior. Let's say it's pornography use. And they may be able to go for a certain length of time without using, and they do what we call white knuckling it, where they say, oh, I'm not gonna use, I'm not gonna do this, I'm not gonna do this, and they will themselves to stop the behavior, but eventually they cave in and the whole addictive cycle begins again. So unmanageability, and then also secrecy is an element of any addiction, so trying to hide their sexual behavior. Also a progression of behaviors. So for some, it may have started with Playboy still pictures when they were 12 or 13 years old, but it eventually progressed to hardcore videos or to more and more bizarre or graphic forms of pornography. And for many sex addicts, that does also escalate into physically acting out with other people. But there is a ramping up of behaviors. One thing that can happen with sex addiction is the person with the addiction can think, well, you know what? I don't really do this every day, so I must not be addicted. It's kind of like thinking that somebody who has a full-time steady job and is able to maintain their driver's license and adult responsibilities must not be an alcoholic because they're not a hobo living under a bridge. Well, the reality is you can have any addiction and have a certain appearance of manageability. Also, addictions involve a continuing on of the addictive behavior, in this case with sex addiction, let's say it's pornography, despite negative consequences. So for example, perhaps a person has had decreased productivity at work and they're getting called in from their boss to say, hey, why aren't you more productive? That's happening because he's been using pornography. But despite that calling in from his boss and the anxiety that is produced because of some negative consequences due to his sexual addiction, he continues on in the addiction. Or perhaps his wife has caught him looking at pornography and is very upset about it and confronts him about it, and it's causing a problem in the marriage. Well, if the man continues to use pornography despite his wife's concerns and her difficulty with it, that's another sign of addiction. Now, it is a possibility that your husband simply has some kind of a sexual integrity struggle, but not an actual sexual addiction. I believe it's always best to get assessed by a sex addiction therapist, somebody who has training and expertise in the area of sexual addiction, and preferably for the wife to get supported by somebody who has training in the trauma model of helping partners of sex addicts. An expert like this will be best able to assess whether or not your husband actually has a sexual addiction or whether it's just a sexual integrity issue. But as we've mentioned before, regardless of addiction or not addiction, if his sexual behavior has impacted you, then it's something that you need support and help for.